These images of Yevgeny Prigozhin's short-lived mutiny caused shockwaves, both inside and outside of Russia. Watching how Russian mercenaries were marching on Moscow kick-started discussions about a possible change of power in Russia. What might Russia's possible futures look like? And what would this mean for us? That's what we're going to delve into during this video.
For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power.
Except for this statement by President Biden, Western leaders repeatedly mention how the future of Russia is a domestic affair, in order not to strengthen suspicions in the Kremlin that the West is pursuing a regime change. Ukrainians tend to be much more upfront about their preferred future, however. They want to see a weakened Russia that's no longer a threat. Whatever the future brings, it's obvious that the fate of Putin's regime is now tied to its war against Ukraine.
We do not have a crystal ball and we can't predict the future. There are many possible futures of Russia. That's why we have mapped out various scenarios with various levels of probability and impact. Together with Dutch and international experts, and based on an extensive literature review, we've analyzed and discussed over 35 factors of influence. Those determine the future pathways of Russia. Let me just show you what that model looks like. With these factors, we were able to present 6 scenarios for Russia's future.
Altogether, the degree of international isolation, as well as the stability of the regime, are the key factors that shape the pathways Russia could take. And if you put those together in a matrix, then these are the outcomes. Hard to digest at a glance, right? Don't worry and stick with us, as we're going to break down those scenarios as brief as possible.
In this scenario, Russia has largely but not decisively lost the war. Faced with battlefield defeats, an economic downturn and domestic discontent, various groups in the Russian elite have temporarily joined forces for a palace coup. The new president then strikes a deal with the West and makes Putin and his loyalists a scapegoat. He enacts limited economic and democratic reforms and reduces repression to reduce public discontent.
The war in Ukraine grinds on for years with lower intensity. Both sides feel like they can eventually win. Yet there is no clear end in sight. Putin is forced to step down due to his personal mismanagement, but the regime itself prevails. A hardline successor is handpicked by the security services. The leader eventually secures political and financial backing from Beijing in exchange for far-reaching economic concessions. There is a similar version of this scenario in which Putin does gain the upper hand in the war and becomes stronger than ever. For this third scenario, check out our report.
Putin has definitively made Russia a global pariah state, for example through the use of a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. In response, China, India and others also abandoned their implicit support for Russia. It is forced to become almost entirely self-sufficient, although it still manages to sell some of its natural resources at bargain prices. The regime nonetheless stays in power through a combination of brutal repression and propaganda of Russia as a besieged fortress.
As the Russian army faces significant losses of territory, personnel and equipment, dissatisfaction spreads amongst its ranks. Due to the continued humiliation on the battlefield, Putin's regime loses legitimacy. Following a catastrophic defeat and withdrawal from the south and east of Ukraine, Russia begins to implode. In a situation comparable to the early 90s, Russia descends into organized chaos with levels of criminality that are very high. In a more extreme version of this scenario, the Russian Federation even falls apart into various smaller states, without a solution for Russia's nuclear arsenal. More on this last scenario in our report.
Experts generally agree that all these scenarios are possible, but they do not agree on how likely they are. They also disagree on which one they would prefer. Most Western Europeans and Americans tend to look at an unstable or fragmenting Russian Federation through the lens of risk management. In Eastern Europe, however, instability in Russia is not necessarily seen as bad, as it would reduce the security threat that Russia poses to them. They are not as worried about the risk of a potential dissolution of Russia.
Although views differ, in all cases the EU and NATO need to think ahead about options and steps they can take right now, regardless of which scenario unfolds. Regarding Russia's future, hope is not a policy. We should prepare for the best, for the worst, and for the status quo. Would you like to explore the scenarios in our recommendations in detail? Check the Clingendael report. After Putin, the deluge? Forecasting the possible futures of the Russian Federation.